Hello YouTube, how's everyone doing? It's Professional here. So I told you guys that we have the next playthrough up pretty soon, and so been doing a lot of World War II games recently, and so I thought that I would do the Medal of Honor Rising Sun. This is also the game that you guys voted for. Now, we finished the Saboteur recently, the open World War II game in France, but I did a lot of World War II games in this channel, but we haven't done any game in the Pacific, and I thought that I would do a Pacific game, and this is, this game is literally one of the, it's one of, like, my childhood games. Like, I love this game so much. I played this game, Medal of Honor Frontline, in the PS2 when these games first came out, so this is one of the more rarer World War II games, back then. The reason is because almost all World War II games, back then, in that era, especially on the PS2, the vast majority of them were, fighting in Europe. But this one is fighting in the Pacific against the Japanese. So this is the American campaign, Pacific campaign. It starts at Pearl Harbor. It goes to Guadalcanal, Singapore, and I think it was in I'm trying to remember the other one. I think it was in Burma also. But it's been a long time since I played this, but I do remember a good chunk of it, and I know history pretty well, and so we can talk about this, time period as, we're going through the game. And I hope you guys like the cosplay, as if you're new to the channel, I do tend to dress up as the characters that I play as in games, and so this is, just a kind of a reproduction of, what the Marines would have wore in the Pacific theater of the war. So anyways, let's start this off here. I hope that you guys enjoy this playthrough, and if you enjoy me playing games like this, do drop a like on it. It does help the channel out a lot. I do have a few videos coming out this week, especially the lore video coming out later this week on GTA. But anyways, let's start this up here. Okay, Also, for people wondering what I'm playing this on, I'm playing the PS2 version on an emulator. And these games are just great for the for their soundtrack in these games. It's just awesome. But trying to remember if there was a Day of Infamy. Trying to remember whether there was a difficulty option in this one. I don't remember whether there was. So I guess we'll just play it as it is. Day of Infamy, yep. This is going to be the Pearl Harbor attack. That the Day of Infamy is a reference to what President Roosevelt actually said. He said December 7th, 1941, a date that would live in infamy.
Looks like we're in store for another beautiful and serene December day.
Hey, Silas. My girl Benny sent me her picture yesterday. Oh, let me tell you about Rita Hayworth. Ain't got nothing on her. Rita Hayworth? Wait a second. I thought you said Betty was a blonde. No, it's Mary Lou. I'll tell you what, Fireboy. I'll put him on a chart.
Move it, you maggots! Move it! So topside, let's go on a double! Hurry up!
So this is the game that came out right after Frontline. Frontline came out in 2002.
It's only dust. Joe Griffin! Follow me, Marine! We need to get topside right now! They're all over the place! They're all over the place!
Hope I don't get a copyright claim for the ship music. But no one was prepared for this when the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And I'm going to talk more about the Pearl Harbor attack, I'll talk more about the Pearl Harbor attack in a little bit here. Okay, here we go, crouch. And there's a lot of optional objectives in this game, like this is one optional objective, like to help the guy close the hatch. There's a few Marines that are actually trapped in a room here. It's an optional objective.
He's still alive! I'll take care of him. I need a fire extinguisher! Give me that thing!
So, oh, another thing I forgot to mention, the bonsai charges in this game scared me when I was a kid when I played this. How old was I when I played this game? I was 9 years old.
Save us! Use the phone! Call headquarters!
This is, you know, how you would save the game. You would go up to one of these.
On your plane, Marine! Now you step out of it! Step out of it! Pick a target!
Soundtrack in this mission is really good too. So basically, you know, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This was directed by Tojo, who was the shogun of Japan. The emperor didn't. The emperor thought that it was a mistake to go to war with America, but he decided on it anyways. Admiral Yamamoto is actually the one who actually planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, because Admiral Yamamoto had actually studied in the U.S., and he was very well familiar with America's industry and America's, you know, capability as pretty much a superpower. And he knew that that Japan would not be able to fight a prolonged war with America. And so basically the idea behind the attack on Pearl Harbor was that the Japanese were going to cripple the American fleet so badly that the U.S. would not be able to launch an attack. But the Japanese underestimated American industry, and they also underestimated American resolve to fight. And if you're wondering, why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? What was the specific reason for that? The reason for that was because at this time, Japan was actually invading a lot of countries in Asia years before Pearl Harbor. They had invaded Manchuria in 1933 in China, and then in 1937 they invaded the rest of China. And, you know, Japan was going on their conquest. They were killing a lot of people. Like, Japan had committed genocide in China. There was the atrocities against the Chinese civilians was just horrible. Like, there was Japanese soldiers that would go into hospitals in China and were just bayoneting everyone that was, like, in a hospital bed. And what happened was, like, the Americans were, like, horrified by this, and basically the U.S. government had told Japan to stop its conquests, or they would put an embargo on Japan. Japan didn't listen. They still kept going on their conquests and kept attacking China. And so what ended up happening was the U.S. embargoed Japan. Now, what a lot of people don't know about is that Japan actually did not have a lot of oil. Only 6% of Japan's oil actually came from Japan itself. The vast majority of Japanese oil actually came from the U.S., so the U.S. was actually their main supplier of oil. And so when the U.S. cut Japan off from oil, that devastated their war machine. And so Japan at that point wanted to gather more oil in Southeast Asia, and so they knew that if they attacked more territories in Southeast Asia, the U.S. would probably respond. And so they decided to attack the U.S. first. That's basically what happened with the Pearl Harbor attack. Down more of these planes, and these are the Japanese Zeros, which I don't know too much about airplanes, but I know that Japanese Zero is like one of the most agile planes of World War II, and the reason that it was so agile was because it practically had no armor. That's what made it so fast. I don't know if I don't know if a ship like Machine Gun would necessarily, like, would take down torpedoes coming at you, but they'd be going a lot faster than this. But basically, on this sequence, you just gotta keep shooting the planes, and eventually you just get knocked off the ship. Also, here's another thing that people don't know about. People think that during the attack on Pearl Harbor that the Japanese were just crashing into U.S. Ships, just doing kamikaze attacks, but that's not really how kamikaze attacks work. And kamikaze attacks, I mean, there was a few rare instances of them happening before 1943, but they didn't start happening until 1943. That's really when they started happening, when Japan started becoming desperate. And basically, with kamikaze attacks, it wasn't that the Japanese wouldn't just fly into, like, ships like people think they would. They would only do that when their plane was damaged. When they didn't think that they could make it back, or their plane was, like, you know, in disrepair, then at that point they would crash into U.S. ships. But they wouldn't crash into, like, a ship with their, you know, their plane being in perfect condition. That typically wouldn't happen. Their plane would have to be damaged first. Damn, I forgot how hard this beginning part was. Yeah, this is much harder than the first mission in Medal of Honor Frontline. Lost most of our health, too. Okay. Yeah, so this always happens. You always get knocked off the ship like this. Okay, bonus objectives completed. Okay, medal and skeleton key awarded. Okay. I shot down 65 planes. Okay. Now here's the thing about the attack of Pearl Harbor is that one of the reasons that the U.S. was actually very unprepared for this attack was also racism. Racism actually played a big role in this, because what actually happened is when Japan actually did attack Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government was just so shocked, but the American public was absolutely the most shocked, and the media in America was just struggling to understand why that happened, and they didn't understand how Japan had the capabilities to attack Pearl Harbor. So what I mean that racism played a role in this is that they underestimated the Japanese. They didn't think that the Japanese had the capability to attack Pearl Harbor. And the thing is, though, the American media at the time, they even said that there's no way that Japan could have attacked Pearl Harbor on their own. They said that Japan must have had help from Germany. But the Germans were actually pretty shocked by this as well. And also, the right after Japan actually attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the U.S. And Hitler got extremely overconfident at that point, because in late 1941, when this was happening, the Germans were actually right outside Moscow. So they were literally a few miles outside of Moscow. Battle of Moscow was raging on at this point. And what happened was the Germans thought that it was only a matter of weeks before the Soviet Union would have collapsed. And so Hitler had gotten really overconfident and thought that nothing could stop him, and he thought that he could take on the U.S. as well. But this event, you know, Battle of Pearl Harbor, this event got America into World War II.
That was close. Let's go. We gotta get underway before one of those bombs hits us. Inbound fighters.
The smoke makes it a little hard to see the Japanese fighters at times.
Inbound, fast and low.
is dropping. All right, Griffin, hold on. We're losing turret pressure. All right, boys, let's get her up and running again. Radio's got haywire. Benelli, fix that thing. What full car? Oh my God! We've lost the Arizona. God help him.
Now, what a lot of people don't know is that when the Arizona actually sunk, that there was actually a lot of Americans that were still trapped in the ship, and they were trapped and they were just dying of just suffocation and drowning to death. So that was the worst deaths, is when you actually got trapped underneath the ship and just drowned to death.
This is Nevada calling any ships available. We are attempting to sortie seaward. We need an escort. I say again, we need an escort. That's us. Hold on! Brace yourselves! They've got valves bearing down on them. We need to help the Nevada. They're coming at us from everywhere. This isn't looking good. We're taking too much damage. We need you to cover our departure. Enemy aircraft, 6 o'clock. Griffin, keep your eyes peeled. Take him down, damn it.
Yeah, first mission in this is actually much harder than the first mission in Frontline, because the Frontline, it was the D-Day.
Nevada, Beta 2-0. We've been ordered to beach so we don't block the harbor exit to sea. Thank you for the escort.
They're turning tail now. Woo, yeah! Yeah, but they won't be back anytime soon. You got that right. That was easier than...
Knock it off! And you listen up, Marines. You take a good long look. I hope none of you ever see a day like this again. Or nobody will ever know what it was like. But maybe the ones who lived through it. You just be damn sure you don't forget the ones who didn't.
Enemy plane shot down 64, so almost the exact same amount again. And, you know, the game also has these real footage.
10 in the morning. The United States suffers one of history's most devastating surprise attacks. With 2,403 dead and her once invincible navy decimated, America is forced to join the conflict already raging in Europe and Asia. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war machine had swept across China, cutting off American aid, and then pressed on into Burma with limited resistance. At home, Japan was building up a seemingly superior naval fleet, led by some of the world's largest aircraft carriers. But Admiral Yamamoto's prediction
He planned Pearl Harbor.
The aftermath of the Day of Infamy had indeed awakened the sleeping giant that was America.
He did say that. He said, "I fear that we have just awoken a sleeping giant."
The United States takes action.
If you're wondering what happened to Admiral Yamamoto, the guy who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, though, the U.S. did get their revenge on him. A year later, they actually, in 1943, they shot down his plane and they killed him. So he was flying on a transport plane. He was flying to one of the islands. Don't remember the one. I think it was in Southeast Asia, and they intercepted him and shot him down and killed him over the ocean. And also, let's just save our game here really quickly. But I want to show you guys something else really cool here. Let's just save our game. Special features. Wanted to show you guys this here also. None there. But this. So after each mission, you get like letters from home.
Dear Joe, you'll never know how happy and relieved we were to hear from you. Mom and I were clearing the lunch dishes when news of the Pearl Harbor attack came on the radio. Mom went all white and dropped a big platter on the floor. Dad finally calmed her down, but I don't think she slept at all, waiting for word that you were all right. There were more photographs in the paper this morning. It must have been horrible to be there, Joe. Thank heaven Donnie wasn't stationed in Hawaii, too. I don't think Mom would have survived the worry. Like everyone else, we listened to the president's speech the next day.
That's
Dad was real
FDR.
quiet afterwards. I think he always believed there'd never be another great war like the one he'd lived through. That evening,
That's
I
a
saw
reference to
an
World War
amazing
I.
sight. I passed by the Army recruitment office, and there were hundreds of men lined up outside. A few boys from my school were there, and 8 men on Dad's shift clocked out and signed right up, the coal dust still on their faces. We hear now that war's been declared, and once you've shipped out, you won't be able to tell us where you are. Write back when you can, and stay safe. Love from your sister, Mary. P.S. Mom wants to keep all the Christmas decorations up until you and Donnie get home, so get this war over with fast.
So yeah, those letters from home were a nice little addition to the game, that after each mission you can just read a letter. Another thing I was going to comment on, oh yeah, so what a lot of people also don't know is that Japan didn't just attack Pearl Harbor. At pretty much the exact same time, right after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Japan went on a major offensive in Asia. They captured several U.S. territories. They attacked Guam, which was a U.S. territory. They attacked Wake Island. A lot of people know Wake Island from Battlefield, but Wake Island was a real island. Japan attacked Wake Island, Guam. They attacked the Philippines, which was pretty much like a U.S. protectorate at the time. They attacked Southeast Asia. They attacked Singapore. They were attacking Malaysia. I'm trying to remember. And then eventually they did push into also Vietnam, that area. So that was referred to as French Indochina at the time. It was a French colony. But Japan went on this major offensive, and they were just attacking and just taking so many territories in Asia. But also, one additional final thing that I want to mention is that Japan, one of the reasons that they got so overconfident and they thought that they could defeat America was because of what happened 40 years prior. Now, 40 years prior to Pearl Harbor, this was 1904 to 1905, so this is more like 36 years prior, 35 years before. Japan went to war with the Russian Empire, so it still wasn't the Soviet Union at the time. It was just like 10 years before World War I. And basically, it was the Russo-Japanese War. What basically happened was that, if you want to know who was right in the Russo-Japanese War, they were both wrong. So both of them were bad in that war. They were both, empires that were trying to expand into Asia. And what happened was the Russian Empire was actually trying to expand into China and into Korea. Now, Japan at the time was trying to create its own empire, and so they wanted to take over Korea. And they eventually did take over Korea. But what happened was Japan had offered the Russian Empire they would basically split Korea in half. And what happened was the Russian Empire said no, and they said that they were going to take all of Korea. And so Japan at that point got really angry and had actually done a sneak attack on Russia and had just destroyed Russia's entire fleet. And what happened was Japan had actually declared war on Russia. It was only I think a few hours before the actual attack, which gave them absolutely no time to prepare themselves. And it was the same thing with Pearl Harbor. Japan, I think they declared war. It was only a few hours before Pearl Harbor, and there was no time to react to that. But Japan basically destroyed the Russian fleet. They obliterated them. And then the Russians tried to send more ships, and the Russians actually had to send their ships all the way around, because Russia couldn't send them through the north because of the cold water, so they sent them all around through Africa, all the way around Africa to Asia. They couldn't even go to the Suez Canal, because what happened was the Suez Canal was too big for the Russian battleships. And there was actually an incident where Great Britain almost declared war on Russia at the time because Russia actually opened fire on a bunch of ships that they thought were Japanese, but they were actually British, fishing ships. and so that caused an international incident. And then eventually what happened was there's a lot of fighting. It went to mainland China, and Japan basically just destroyed Russia in that war. There was like some battles that were kind of close, but the war went much worse for the Russians than it did for the Japanese. Eventually, President Teddy Roosevelt at the time had helped to end that war. And what happened was this basically caused massive humiliation for Russia, that a giant country like Russia got defeated by a small country like Japan. Well, not really a small country, but, you know, compared to the size of Russia. Like that a country the size of Japan defeated a country the size of Russia, and a country that's just so far away from Russia had defeated Russia. That was the first time in like 800 years that a European power had lost to an Asian power. The last time that had happened was with the Mongolian conquest in Eastern Europe. So it was massive humiliation for Russia, and gave Japan like a lot of like pride and confidence in itself, and gave Japan like a lot of arrogance. And so when Japan had just beaten Russia so badly, they thought that they could defeat America no problem. Now, the issue with that argument is that Russia had no industry at the time. I mean, it did have some industry, but its industry was garbage compared to, like, you know, during the Soviet times, their industry was, you know, much bigger and was able to mass produce stuff. During the times of the Russian Empire, their industry wasn't so big. And so they didn't have the same industry that America did. And so America had just much more of an industry, much greater of an industry. And so they underestimated that. Plus, America was just, you know, much more prepared and just wealthier nation than just Russia was, where the Russians were, in the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians were struggling to arm their own soldiers. And the Russians were actually even buying weapons from the U.S. during the Russo-Japanese War. They bought Winchester rifles from the U.S. That's how desperate the Russians were in the Russo-Japanese War. So this is even before Soviet times. The Russians were always ill-equipped, but the U.S. wasn't like that. U.S. logistics were like some of the best in the world, and the best arguably in the war. So Japan severely underestimated the U.S., and they thought that they would be able to walk over them like Russia, but that wasn't the case. But I hope you guys enjoy the history. I do like to read history a lot, and so I do know a lot about this topic and this time period. But we'll continue the next part as soon as I can. So I'll probably have the next part up tomorrow. Thank you guys for watching, and again, if you guys enjoyed this series, do drop a like. It does help the series out a lot. Thank you for watching. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful day.